Jim Chalmers is putting his final touches on next week's federal budget, which is expected to be filled with election promises. The Treasurer was in the United States last week meeting his counterparts from a range of countries, along with the head of the US Federal Reserve, the IMF and the World Bank. Let's bring in Adam Creighton, Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper. Adam, thanks for your time. You caught up with Chalmers when he was in Washington last week. He's been talking up doom and gloom a lot recently. What vibe did you get from him when you spoke to him?
Well, I think it's fair to say he was talking up doom and gloom here as well. And I think that's fair enough. It's very worrying times, I think, to be treasurer of a major country or indeed any country now. He met with a range of finance ministers from other G20 countries, as you say. He also met the chairman of the Federal Reserve to hear about the likely path of interest rates in the US, which, of course, has massive effect on the Australian dollar, which has been falling, as you know. I think it's about 62, 63 cents. I remember when I arrived here last year, it was 77. So that is an extraordinary decline with, of course, massive implications for Australian imports and exports, and also future inflation and future interest rates in Australia. And I'm sure Jerome Powell told him that the likely direction of rates is up, and considerably up. I mean, after we saw those inflation figures in the US last week, which I think came out on the day that Chalmers met the chairman, they were very worrying. You know, they showed that core inflation, which is what all the economists look at, was up 6.6%, I believe, over the year. And the overall rate of inflation has been above 8% for 7 months in a row. 7 months, that is quite extraordinary. And that means central banks, both here in Australia, in the UK, are going to have to jack up rates much, much more.
Yeah, I heard a rumour that Chalmers may have walked out of that meeting with Jerome Powell ashen-faced. Do you think the chair of the Federal Reserve might have basically told him they're willing to do whatever it takes to push down inflation, even if that means tipping the US economy into recession?
Well, look, I think they have to. I mean, I think I think Australia and the US have, fairly similar economic dynamics at the moment. I mean, Australia is maybe a few months behind, but, the inflation rate, of course, is increasing. We saw recently in New Zealand a massive increase there on the upside. Probably the same thing's going to happen in Australia next week when we get the third quarter. The interesting difference, I think, about the two countries is wages are not growing as fast in Australia, which is, I guess, bad in a sense, because it means real wages are falling even faster in Australia, which, of course, is a huge political concern for the government. But yes, certainly the Fed has to keep its credibility. One interesting thing is that inflation expectations, and this is about the only silver lining there is if you talk to US economists, is still about 2.5%, 3% in 5 years' time. So people seem to think, when you ask them in surveys, and also on financial markets, they think that inflation will fall back to 2 or 3%. And that's quite an impressive achievement. And of course, central bankers like to put that down to their credibility. And they say if they lose their credibility, then suddenly those expectations could increase very rapidly. And once that happens, it's the 1970s all over again.
And at the same time, it seems like President Joe Biden is claiming the US economy won't fall into a recession. So how's that being received over there in the States?
Well, certainly Chalmers did not receive it very well, because one of the first things he said in his press conference was that he disagreed with the president. So I thought that was quite amusing. And I mean, to be fair, I think Jim Chalmers is right. I think the risk of a recession here in the US next year is very high. The reality is, as we just discussed, interest rates are going to keep on climbing. At some point, that is going to hit the housing market here, housing construction, car purchases, to a point where there is a significant slowdown. Now, so far, that has not happened, which has been somewhat puzzling. You've still got a jobless rate here of, I think, 3.7, 3.5. Don't quote me on that, but it's very, very low. That hasn't increased yet. But again, if you look at history, if you look at the past 40 years of recessions in the US, the unemployment rate will increase very suddenly and very rapidly. And that's what we could be looking at early next year.
You're currently in Arizona for the midterm elections, where all the seats in the US House of Representatives are up for election, along with some state governor positions too. What's the atmosphere like in Phoenix at the moment?
Well, look, I think there's a real push towards the Republicans here. I went to a rally last night for Kari Lake to see what was going on there, and she is the Republican candidate for governor. She started well behind a couple of months ago in the polls and the betting markets, and now she's well ahead and looks like winning. And I think that's a trend that is reflected across the country. I mean, I just checked this morning. If you look at the betting markets for the US Senate, which is probably what everyone's looking at, it's 50-50 at the moment. Obviously, Democrats want to maintain their control of it with the vice president's casting vote, but it's looking more and more likely that the Republicans will retake it. They had a 35% chance of taking it about 4 weeks ago, and now it's 65%, which is an enormous turnaround. And political analysts aren't quite sure why. Nothing seems to have really happened. The best candidates are that those last week's inflation figures really worried Americans. But whatever the case, it's certainly looking up for Republicans, and certainly here in Arizona too, I would say.